Hey guys, it's Courtney, and I am here with a design team project for Kindred stamps. I'm using the Plumber Brothers stamp set, and I wanted to create a huge scene. So I'm doing a trifold card here, and I'm using a piece of Bristol smooth cardstock because it is larger. And I just scored that at every 4 inches, so it is slightly smaller than an A2 size card. I also cut some panels 5.5 by 4 out of Nina Solar White and one that's just slightly smaller than that so that my card will fold correctly. I marked that one with a little X so I don't get confused as to which one is which. I adhered these panels together with some post-it note tape on the back just so that it would be easier to create one fluent scene. I'm going to be stamping with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink because I will be Copic coloring my images. And I started by stamping out this little brick all along the bottom. Now I'm not using a stamp positioner here. I'm just kind of doing the best I can as far as lining these little bricks up. And I'm not masking these out individually. I'll go ahead and mask these out with some post-it note tape before I do my ink blending. Next, I stamped out my little characters and masked those out with Simon Says Stamp masking paper. And I wanted a little character on each one of these panels, so I went ahead and stamped those out to the left-hand side, except for the little princess. She's all the way at the end. Once my little characters were all stamped out, I filled in my little scene with the other images within the stamp set. I drew a line with my T-squared ruler and a very light pencil line just so that when I stamped out the bricks on the top, they would be somewhat even with one another. And I just used that pencil line as my guide. Now I usually mask out each image as I go just because I have forgotten to go back and mask them out. And once I do my ink blending, once that ink is down, you can lighten it, but you can't completely take it away. So I do suggest that you place your masks down as you're stamping. Now I'm not overlapping any of my images. So this is a really great set and a great scene to create if you're new at scene building. Even though we are masking them, we're masking them strictly because we're going to be putting distress oxides down. But normally you would stamp and mask out whatever image you would want to be in front of another. But in this case, we're not even going to bother to overlap any of the images. Once everything was stamped out and masked, I will go ahead and take that post-it note tape and run that all along the bottom, lining it up with those little bricks that I had stamped the best I can. They're not completely even, but in the end, once they're colored, you won't be able to tell the difference. I'm going to go ahead and work on my Ranger craft mat here, and I'll be using Salty Ocean Distress ink to cover the entire background. I'm not worried about getting any kind of blend here. I want it to be a solid color. This is more of an animated card, so I'm not looking for a realistic look here. Now, a little tip for your distress oxides. I know that I've seen a lot of posts on Facebook and Instagram that people were struggling with getting a good blend. I go over mine twice. I go over with a light hand, cover my entire panel, or in this case, all 3 panels, and then I'll go back over again and continue to blend that out, and you'll get more of a solid color. And this is true for if you're using 2 or 3 colors as well. Once all of my masks and my distress ink was dry a little bit, I moved on to the Copic coloring, and I skip around a lot. I don't necessarily start with one panel, finish it, and then move on to the next. I'm trying to do all my colors at one time. So I'm going to start off with my skin tones, and I'm going to be coloring all 3 of my little characters with the same skin tones. Concentrating underneath his little hat being the darkest, and over to the left being he's kind of facing off to the right a little bit. There would be a shadow off to the left. This little guy, I concentrated underneath his hat and his little sideburns. And there's really, I'm not worried about a light source here. Like I said, this is more of an animated card. So I'm just concentrating my darkest colors being on either side. For their little hair that's hanging down from underneath their hat, as well as their little mustaches, these would normally be black. So I am using my black marker, my 100 marker, but I'm blending that out with a C7 and a C5 just to give it just a little bit of dimension. The contrast is very minimal. You wouldn't really even be able to tell unless you're real close up. This C7 is so close to black anyway. But I'm coloring both of these little guys, both their hair and their mustaches, the same. And then I'll move on to the little princess. I'm using the same skin tones for her as well, starting off with my lightest color, which will be underneath her hair where her little bangs are hanging over her face. Now you can see her little crown there. Some of the mask had come up a little bit when I did my ink blending. So I just took a very damp paintbrush and went over that and then dabbed it up with a paper towel a few times. This isn't watercolor paper, so you don't want to add too much water, but I'll save that till last just because the paper is a little bit wet and you want to make sure that's completely dry before you move on to your coloring. Next, for the bricks on the bottom and the ones on the top as well, I'm coloring these the same way. Starting off with my E18 and just flicking out a little bit from each section within these little bricks from the left. And then I will flick that out a little bit further with my E15. I'm only showing you one brick here because actually this took a little bit of time. But once all of my bricks were colored with these two colors, I went over the entire area with my E13. I wasn't worried about blending. I did want to keep that contrast a little bit. So I just quickly went over the entire area with the E15, or I'm sorry, the E13. Next, for these little question mark boxes, I wanted to make these somewhat like a gold color, but I wanted the question mark to stand out a little bit. So I just added my shading to the little frame of this box as well as the question mark itself. And then went back in with my Y23 and went over the entire area again. These colors are pretty similar. You're not going to get all that much of a contrast, but I did want to make sure that the question mark stood out just a little bit. Next, I will move on to this little princess's hair, and I want to make her a blonde, but I am going in with my E15 as my darkest color and just flicking up from the bottom and the top underneath her little tiara or crown there, and then up from the base of her hair. And then when I move on to my Y markers, I'm going to go over the entire area because I want to make this more of a yellow. I'm going to blend that brownish color out by going over the entire thing rather than starting off where my flicking ended. Again, I don't want to make this look all that realistic. So once I was done with my flicking, I kind of just covered up the entire area with that solid color. For her dress, I'm going to be using my R80 markers, and the darkest areas will be basically on either side. And I'll go in with my darkest color, blend that out with my mid-tone, and then go back to my lightest color. And next I'll move on to these little tubes, I guess. I don't know what you would call them. Tunnels. I'm not sure what they would be. But these are round objects. So I am going to concentrate my darkest area being on either side, and then underneath the top part of it would create a shadow. And I'm using varying size flicks here. I know I mentioned in my other video that this kind of reminded me of like a heart monitor, the ups and downs of the heart. And this will give you a little bit of variation and give you the idea or the illusion that this object is round. I'm leaving a pretty strong highlight right there in the center. Next, for the little overalls that these two little guys have, I'm going to be using my B90 markers. This is my favorite combination to make anything denim or jeans. I usually use the B99 as well, but this time I just started with my B97 as my darkest. Concentrating on the darkest areas being on either side and underneath where his arms are folded. For this first little character, his hat and his shirt, I am coloring red and being extremely careful. I find that I have a little bit of a difficult time using the colorless blender over distress oxides. I don't have any problem over regular distress inks, and reds are very hard to take up anyway, so I'm just being extremely careful, especially with my darkest red here. My darkest areas will be on either side of the little brim of his hat, and that would also create a shadow on the top part of his hat. And I'm blending that out with my two midtones, leaving that little circle on his hat white, and then blending out with my R22 as my highlight. For my next little guy, his hat and his outfit will be green, basically coloring it the same way, highlight on either side. For his little brim of the hat, it's hard to tell, but I'm leaving a small white area on the top where it meets the top of his hat, and saving that for my highlight color, just so that I'm not putting those two darkest colors right next to each other. And also leaving that little circle there in the center, I'm leaving that white as well. Next, for this little guy, I'm going to color him brown, concentrating the highlight being in the center again. No particular light source, but the way he's shaped, I would think that he'd be kind of round. So I'm coloring as if he is a rounder object. His body, I will color with my E30 markers just to give a little bit of contrast between his head and his body. For this little plant, first I colored his shoes black because I wasn't sure what color to color them, so I just left those completely black. For this little plant here coming out of this tube, I'm coloring that all pretty much green, and then just concentrating my highlights being on the opening of the flower. I guess it would be like the mouth. And then using my E30 markers just for the stem and the leaves. For the little mushroom on top of this question mark box, I'm coloring him yellow and orange. Again, highlight being in the center. Not only is that the easiest light source to color, it's also a round object. For the little spots on the mushroom, I'm coloring those with YR markers. And again, just making them darker on either side. And the lightest color will be right there in the center. Next, I'll go in and fill in all my white areas, and I'll be using my C3 and C1 to make it look like these objects are white, just adding in where my darkest areas will be, then flicking those out with the C1 to white. So it's okay to leave some white space and just use the C markers to create your shadow. Now for her crown, I realized the paper did kind of warp a little bit, I guess you'd say. So I'm going in with a gold gel pen and just filling in that area. It is opaque, so if you do color up or color over the black lines of the stamped image, you can go over that with a Copic Safe pen just to fill in those areas. Also, the Distress Oxides are opaque as well. So once you mask your images, if any of those black lines were showing, they're no longer going to be black once you cover them up with Distress Oxides. Just go in with your Copic Safe pen and fix those areas up. Next, I stamped my sentiment using VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I wanted some sort of sentiment on each panel, so I just put the one up on the first one, and then the thank you, and then the rest of that sentiment all the way there on the third panel. Next, to fill in any of the white gaps that my mask may have covered up when I did my ink blending, I just compare the ink color to my Copics and just go in and very lightly, with a very light hand, tip barely touching the cardstock, you can touch up those areas. Next, you can see that when I scored my cardstock here, it left rough edges. This cardstock is not meant to be scored. So I just take my sand eraser and fix that up a little bit. It's going to be mostly covered, but to kind of get rid of those ugly edges, you can use your sand eraser. I use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to go ahead and adhere each panel. And off camera, I did create a very basic panel for my front, so it's not completely just white. Now make sure, if you're using a dry or a wet glue like I did, make sure it's dry before you try to fold it, because you can see mine kind of bubbled up there. But once it dried, it was perfectly fine. That's it for today. Thanks so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a great day.